Imagine being locked in complete darkness. Not for hours, not for days, for years. You can't see your hand in front of your face. You can't tell if it's day or night. Time loses all meaning. The walls are so close you can touch both sides at once. The air is thick, suffocating, filled with the stench of human waste and decay. You hear sounds, screams from other prisoners, rats scurrying across stone, water dripping, and sometimes, worst of all, footsteps approaching your cell. Because footsteps mean they're coming for you. This wasn't a nightmare. This was reality for thousands of prisoners throughout history. Welcome to the world's most notorious prisons, places where human suffering reached depths that are almost impossible to comprehend, where torture wasn't just physical, but psychological, where hope didn't just fade, it was systematically destroyed, where death wasn't the worst thing that could happen to you. These weren't modern correctional facilities. These were dungeons, fortresses, and stone tombs designed not to rehabilitate, but to break the human spirit, to punish, to terrify, to make examples of those who challenged authority or simply found themselves on the wrong side of power. The prisons you're about to discover held some of history's most famous prisoners: queens, revolutionaries, gangsters, and countless forgotten souls whose names were lost to time. Some were guilty. Many were innocent. All suffered in ways that will haunt you. We're going to walk through 5 of the most terrifying prisons ever built. Places where the very stones seemed to absorb the screams of the damned. Where cells were carved from solid rock. Where prisoners were forgotten in oubliettes, literally forgotten places, left to die in darkness. Where public executions drew crowds of 100,000 people, treating human death as entertainment. First, we'll enter the Tower of London, where queens were beheaded and torture was an art form. Where prisoners carved their final messages into stone walls, knowing they would never leave alive. Then we'll descend into the Bastille, the French fortress that became such a symbol of tyranny that its destruction sparked a revolution. Where one prisoner's identity was so dangerous he was forced to wear an iron mask for decades. We'll cross the ocean to Alcatraz, the Rock, where America's most dangerous criminals were sent to break. Where the sounds of San Francisco parties drifted across the water, tormenting prisoners with what they could never have. Where the hole drove men insane in complete darkness. We'll travel to an island fortress off the coast of France, the Château d'If, where prisoners were entombed in cells carved into rock, some never seeing sunlight again. Where escape was impossible and hope died within weeks. And finally, we'll stand outside Newgate Prison in London, where for 700 years, the condemned were paraded before roaring crowds and hanged as public spectacle. Where disease killed more prisoners than execution ever did. Where children were imprisoned alongside hardened criminals and left to die. These places existed. These horrors happened. The screams were real. The suffering was real. The death was real. And the worst part? Some of these prisons operated well into the 20th century, within living memory. So take a breath. Steel yourself. Because we're about to descend into the darkest corners of human history, into prisons that were living nightmares. Let's begin with the most famous prison in the world, a place where royalty died and where the walls still echo with the ghosts of the condemned. Welcome to the Tower of London. The Tower of London, May 19th, 1536. Dawn. A woman walks across Tower Green. She's dressed in a gray gown trimmed with fur. Her hair is bound up beneath a white coif. She's only 35 years old, but she walks like someone much older, exhausted, defeated. Her name is Anne Boleyn. She's the Queen of England, and in moments she will be dead. She climbs the scaffold. A crowd has gathered, nobility, courtiers, the morbidly curious. She speaks briefly, her voice steady despite her terror. She forgives the executioner. She prays. Then she kneels. The executioner is an expert, brought specially from France. He uses a sword, not an axe. It's considered more merciful, more dignified for a queen. He raises the blade, one swift stroke, and Boleyn, Queen of England, mother of the future Queen Elizabeth I, is dead. Her crime? Failing to give King Henry VIII a son, and perhaps being inconvenient. This is the Tower of London. For over 900 years, this fortress on the Thames has served as palace, armory, treasury, and most famously, prison. But not just any prison. A prison for the highest-ranking prisoners in England, royalty, nobles, political enemies, and religious dissenters. Being sent to the Tower was both a privilege and a death sentence. Privileged because you were important enough to be held in the king's own fortress. A death sentence because very few who entered through Traitor's Gate ever left alive. Traitor's Gate. Even the name sends chills. This Watergate on the Thames was where prisoners arrived by boat. As you passed beneath its portcullis, you knew your life was effectively over. And Boleyn entered through Traitor's Gate. So did her daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, imprisoned by her half-sister Mary. So did countless others who would never see freedom again. The Tower held some of history's most famous prisoners. Guy Fawkes, who tried to blow up Parliament in the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, was tortured here on the rack. His signature before torture was bold and clear. After the rack, he could barely hold a pen. His confession was signed with a trembling, illegible scrawl. The rack. Let's talk about that for a moment. Imagine being strapped to a wooden frame. Your wrists and ankles are bound to rollers. Then the rollers are turned. Slowly, your body stretches. Your joints begin to separate. The pain is excruciating. You hear popping sounds, your shoulders dislocating, your hips pulling apart. You scream. You beg. You confess to anything they want. And if the rack wasn't enough, there was the scavenger's daughter. This device did the opposite. It compressed your body into an agonizing fetal position until blood poured from your nose and ears. Prisoners lasted minutes before passing out. But physical torture wasn't the worst part of the Tower. It was the psychological torture, the waiting. Prisoners could be held for months, even years, never knowing when their execution would come. They lived in constant terror. Every footstep in the corridor could be the guards coming for them. Every sound could signal their death. Lady Jane Grey was only 16 when she was imprisoned in the Tower. She'd been Queen of England for 9 days before being overthrown. For 8 months, she waited in her cell, knowing she would die. She watched her husband being led to execution. Then, on February 12, 1554, it was her turn. She was so young, so terrified. She fumbled for the execution block, blindfolded, crying, "What shall I do? Where is it?" Someone guided her hands to the block. She laid her head down. The axe fell. She was a child. Her crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. The Tower held darker mysteries too. In 1483, 2 young princes, Edward V, age 12, and Richard, age 9, were imprisoned in the Tower by their uncle, who would become King Richard III. The princes were seen playing in the Tower grounds. Then they vanished. They were never seen again. In 1674, workmen discovered 2 small skeletons buried beneath a staircase in the Tower. Were these the princes? Were they murdered? By whom? The mystery remains unsolved over 500 years later. Walk through the Tower today, and you'll see something haunting. Prisoner inscriptions. Carved into the stone walls are the final messages of the condemned. Names. dates, prayers, symbols of hope or despair. One prisoner carved an elaborate astronomical clock. It took him months. What else did he have to do but wait for death? Another carved simply, Jane. Was it his wife? His daughter? Someone he would never see again? These inscriptions are ghosts made permanent, proof that real people suffered here, that they existed, that they wanted to be remembered. The tower's execution site, Tower Green, is a small, peaceful patch of grass today, but it's soaked in blood, and Bullen died here. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, died here. Lady Jane Grey died here, and countless others whose names history forgot. Most prisoners weren't executed privately on Tower Green, though. That was a privilege reserved for nobility. Common prisoners were taken to Tower Hill, just outside the fortress, and executed publicly. Their heads were displayed on spikes on London Bridge as warnings. The Tower of London operated as a prison until 1952. The last execution happened during World War II. German spies were shot in the tower. Think about that. This medieval fortress, wherein Bullen was beheaded with a sword in 1536, was still executing prisoners in the 1940s. Today, the tower is a tourist attraction. Millions visit every year. They take photos. They admire the crown jewels. They listen to the yeoman warders tell stories. But if you're quiet, if you listen carefully, some say you can still hear the screams, still feel the terror that soaked into these stones over 9 centuries. The Tower of London, where queens died, where torture was refined to an art, where hope went to die. But as terrifying as the tower was, it was at least public. People knew you were there. Your imprisonment was recorded. The next prison was different. It was a place where you could vanish completely, where the king could imprison you with a single letter, no trial, no explanation, where you could be forgotten forever in a cell so deep, so dark, that even your name would disappear. Welcome to the Bastille. The Bastille, Paris, 1703. A prisoner arrives at the Bastille. He's escorted by armed guards. But there's something strange about him, something unsettling. He's wearing a mask, not a cloth mask, an iron mask, locked onto his head. He's worn it for years. He'll wear it until he dies. No one knows his identity. The guards are forbidden to speak to him. His face must never be seen. His name must never be spoken. He's the most mysterious prisoner in history, the man in the iron mask. The Bastille. The very name became synonymous with tyranny. This massive fortress in Paris, with walls 80 feet high and towers that dominated the skyline, was the ultimate symbol of royal power and oppression. But it wasn't always a prison. Built in the 1300s as a fortress to defend Paris, it was converted into a state prison in the 1600s. And that's when it became truly terrifying, because the Bastille operated on a system called lettres de cachet, royal letters sealed with the king's seal. With one of these letters, the king could imprison anyone. No trial, no charges, no explanation, no time limit. You could be arrested at dinner, thrown into the Bastille, and simply disappear. Your family wouldn't know where you were. They couldn't appeal. They couldn't visit. You were gone, and you might never come out. The Bastille held political prisoners, religious dissenters, especially Protestants during Catholic persecution, writers who criticized the monarchy, and anyone who annoyed someone with royal connections. It was arbitrary imprisonment at its worst, but the physical prison was as terrifying as the legal system. The Bastille had 8 towers, each containing cells. But the worst cells weren't in the towers. They were below, deep below, the oubliettes, the forgetting places. These were cells at the bottom of the fortress, below ground level. Some were barely large enough to stand in. Dark, damp, cold. Rats everywhere. No light ever reached these cells. No sound from the outside world. Prisoners in the oubliettes were literally forgotten. Guards might remember to bring food. They might not. Some prisoners died of starvation. Others went mad in the darkness and silence. One prisoner was found after years in an oubliette. He'd lost the ability to speak. He'd forgotten his own name. He'd become something less than human. Solitary confinement was the Bastille's specialty. Not for days or weeks, for years, decades even. Imagine being alone with your thoughts for 10 years, 20 years. No conversation, no human contact except when guards shoved food through a slot. No books, no writing materials. Nothing but darkness and silence, and the slow dissolution of your sanity. Many prisoners went insane. They talked to themselves, hallucinated. Some clawed at the walls until their fingers bled. Others simply gave up and died. The Marquis de Sade was imprisoned in the Bastille for 13 years. He wrote his most disturbing works there, scratching words onto any surface he could find. The Bastille didn't break him, but it certainly didn't improve his mental state. Voltaire, the famous philosopher and writer, was imprisoned twice in the Bastille for criticizing the government. His experiences there shaped his lifelong fight against tyranny and arbitrary power. But let's return to the man in the iron mask, because this mystery has captivated people for over 300 years. Who was he? Why was his identity so dangerous that he had to wear a mask for decades? Theories abound. Was he the twin brother of King Louis XIV, hidden away to prevent a succession crisis? Was he a disgraced nobleman who knew state secrets? Was he a political prisoner whose very existence was an embarrassment to the crown? We know a few facts. He was imprisoned in 1669. He wore a mask, probably velvet, not iron, but the legend says iron. He was treated relatively well, given decent quarters and food, but he could never remove the mask, never reveal his face, never speak his name. He died in the Bastille in 1703. He was buried quickly, under a false name. His cell was scrubbed clean. His possessions were burned. Even the plates he ate from were melted down. Someone wanted his identity erased from history, and it worked. Over 3 centuries later, we still don't know who he was. The Bastille became such a symbol of oppression that it sparked a revolution. On July 14, 1789, a mob of Parisians stormed the fortress. They expected to find hundreds of political prisoners suffering in dungeons. They found 7, just 7 prisoners. The Bastille was nearly empty, but it didn't matter. The Bastille represented everything wrong with the monarchy: arbitrary power, injustice, cruelty. The revolutionaries tore it down stone by stone. They danced on its ruins. They made souvenirs from its rubble. Today, nothing remains of the Bastille except its outline marked in the pavement of the Place de la Bastille. But its legacy lives on. Bastille Day, July 14th, is France's national holiday, a celebration of freedom over tyranny. Yet we should remember, the Bastille was real. The suffering was real. The man in the iron mask was real. The thousands of prisoners who vanished into its cells were real. Some were guilty of crimes. Many were guilty only of thinking differently, believing differently, or angering the wrong person. They disappeared into darkness. They were forgotten. They died alone. The Bastille, where you could vanish with a stroke of the king's pen, where darkness and solitude drove men insane, where one prisoner's identity was so dangerous he wore a mask for 34 years. But the Bastille was in the past. Surely modern prisons, enlightened by progress and human rights, Would be better? Not quite. The next prison operated in the 20th century, in America, in sight of San Francisco, and it was designed to break the unbreakable, to crush the spirits of men who thought they were tough. It was called Alcatraz, but prisoners knew it by another name, The Rock. Alcatraz, The Rock, June 11, 1962. Night. 3 men squeeze through impossibly small ventilation shafts. They've spent months digging, months planning. They've made dummy heads from soap and hair to fool the guards during bed checks. They've built a raft from raincoats. Now they're crawling through the walls of Alcatraz. Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin. They reach the roof. They climb down. They reach the shore. They inflate their raft and paddle into the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay. They're never seen again. Did they make it? Did they drown? The FBI says they died, but no bodies were ever found. And in 2013, a letter arrived claiming to be from John Anglin, saying all 3 survived. This is Alcatraz, the prison that was supposed to be escape-proof, the prison that held America's most dangerous criminals, the prison that was so brutal, so inhumane, that the government eventually shut it down, not because the prisoners deserved better, but because the cruelty had become too much even for hardened criminals. Alcatraz Island sits in San Francisco Bay, just 1.25 miles from the city. On a clear day, prisoners could see San Francisco. They could see people living normal lives. They could hear sounds drifting across the water, parties, music, laughter, celebrations on New Year's Eve. This was psychological torture at its finest. Freedom was right there, so close, but impossibly far. The water was freezing, around 50 degrees. The currents were treacherous. Sharks patrolled the bay. Even if you escaped the prison, the water would kill you. At least, that's what the guard said. And 36 men tried to escape anyway. 23 were caught. 6 were shot and killed. 2 drowned. And 3, Morris and the Anglins, vanished. Alcatraz operated as a federal prison from 1934 to 1963. It held a maximum of 336 prisoners at any time. These weren't ordinary criminals. These were the worst of the worst. Criminals who'd cause problems at other prisons. Men who were too dangerous, too violent, too escape-prone for anywhere else. Al Capone was here, the Chicago mob boss who terrorized the city during Prohibition. Alcatraz broke him. He spent his time playing banjo in the prison band, slowly losing his mind to syphilis. George Machine Gun Kelly was here, the notorious gangster who coined the term G-men for FBI agents. He died in Alcatraz, never having escaped. Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, was here, though he never actually kept birds in Alcatraz. That was Hollywood fiction. The real Stroud was a violent murderer who spent 42 years in solitary confinement. Alcatraz was his final stop. The rules at Alcatraz were simple and brutal. Silence at all times except during recreation. No newspapers. No radios. No contact with the outside world except 1 letter per month and 1 visit per month, both heavily monitored and censored. You had 4 rights: food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Everything else was a privilege that could be taken away. And if you broke the rules, you went to D block, isolation, solitary confinement. And if you broke the rules in D block, you went to the hole. The hole, officially called the strip cell. This was a dark, steel box cell in D block. Complete darkness. No light, no sound, no furniture, no clothes. You were stripped naked and thrown into absolute darkness. The temperature was freezing. You slept on a concrete floor. Once a day, you got a piece of bread and a cup of water. Every 3rd day, you got a meal. You could be in the hole for days, weeks. The record was 19 days. 19 days in complete darkness, naked, freezing, alone, with nothing but your thoughts. Men came out of the hole broken. Some went insane. Some never recovered. One prisoner, Roof Percival, was so desperate to escape the hole's psychological torture that he cut his own Achilles tendon with a hatchet. He preferred physical pain to the mental torture of darkness and isolation. Another prisoner, Ed Wutka, slashed his throat with his own glasses in the hole. He survived, but the scars, physical and mental, never healed. The most famous inmate to experience the hole was Henry Young. He spent 3 years in isolation after a failed escape attempt. When he finally emerged, he was so damaged that he murdered another inmate. His trial exposed the brutality of Alcatraz's solitary confinement. His lawyer argued that Alcatraz had driven him insane. The jury agreed. Young was convicted only of involuntary manslaughter, not murder. It was a stunning rebuke of Alcatraz's methods. But the psychological torture wasn't just the hole. It was everything about Alcatraz. It was hearing San Francisco across the water, parties, celebrations, normal life, while you rotted in a cell. It was seeing the city lights at night, knowing you would never walk those streets again. It was the silence, the endless, oppressive silence. No talking, no human connection. Just you and your thoughts and your regrets. It was the cold. Alcatraz was never heated. The San Francisco fog rolled in, and the prison was freezing. Prisoners wore whatever they could find to stay warm. It was the hopelessness. Alcatraz was the end of the line. If you were sent here, you weren't leaving. This was where you would die, and many did, not from execution. Alcatraz never executed anyone, but from suicide, from violence, from simply giving up. The suicide rate at Alcatraz was astronomical. Men threw themselves off tiers. They hanged themselves in their cells. They slashed their wrists. Anything to escape the psychological torture. In 1963, the government shut down Alcatraz. The official reason was cost. The prison was expensive to operate. But the real reason was that Alcatraz had become too cruel, too inhumane, even for hardened criminals. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who ordered the closure, said that Alcatraz represented a way of treating prisoners that was no longer acceptable in a civilized society. Today, Alcatraz is a tourist attraction. Over 1 million people visit each year. They take the ferry from San Francisco. They tour the cell blocks. They stand in the hole and try to imagine the darkness. But they leave after a few hours. The prisoners never did. Alcatraz, where America's most dangerous criminals were sent to break. Where isolation and silence drove men insane. Where freedom was visible but unreachable. Where 3 men vanished into the bay, and we still don't know if they made it. But Alcatraz, at least, was on the map. People knew it existed. Families could visit. There was some connection to the outside world. The next prison offered no such comfort. It was an island fortress where prisoners were cut off from everything. Where escape was impossible. Where men were entombed alive in cells carved from solid rock. Welcome to the Chateau d'If. Toto d'If, if you've read The Count of Monte Cristo, you know the Chateau d'If, the fortress prison where Edmond Dantes was falsely imprisoned for 14 years, where he met the Abbé Faria, who taught him everything and revealed the location of a hidden treasure, where Dantes escaped by sewing himself into a burial shroud and being thrown into the sea. It's one of literature's greatest adventure stories, a tale of injustice, suffering, escape, and revenge. But here's what Alexandre Dumas didn't tell you in his novel. The real Chateau d'If was worse, much worse. and escape was impossible. The Chateau d'If sits on a tiny island in the Mediterranean, about a mile off the coast of Marseille, France. It's a fortress built in the 1500s, originally designed to defend Marseille from attack. But it was never used for defense. Instead, it became a prison, a very special kind of prison, a prison from which no one ever escaped. The island is small, barely 30,000 square meters. The fortress takes up most of it. It's surrounded by water, cold water, rough water, water with currents so strong that even experienced swimmers can't fight them. And in the 1700s and 1800s, when the Chateau d'If was at its peak as a prison, there were rumors of sharks in these waters. Whether true or not, the rumors were enough. No prisoner wanted to test them. The Chateau d'If held political prisoners, religious prisoners, and anyone else the French monarchy wanted to disappear. Like the Bastille, prisoners could be sent here with a lettre de cachet, no trial, no charges, no time limit. But unlike the Bastille, which was in Paris, where people might remember you, the Chateau d'If was isolated, out of sight, out of mind. Once you were sent to the island, you were forgotten. The prison had 3 levels of cells. The upper level was for wealthy or noble prisoners. These cells had windows, light, relatively decent conditions. If you had money, you could even pay for better food, furniture, books. The middle level was for common prisoners. These cells were darker, smaller, but still livable. And then there was the lower level. The lower level cells were carved directly into the rock of the island. No windows, no light, no ventilation, just solid rock on all sides. Damp, cold, dark. These cells were tombs, and the prisoners in them were the living dead. Imagine being locked in a stone cell barely large enough to lie down. The walls are wet with condensation. The air is thick and stale. You can't see anything. Not your hand. Not the walls. Nothing. You don't know if it's day or night. You lose track of time. Days blend into weeks. Weeks into months. Months into years. You're fed through a slot in the door. Sometimes, the guards might forget or decide you don't deserve food today. There's nothing you can do about it. You hear sound sometimes. Waves crashing against the fortress. Gulls crying. Other prisoners screaming. Or maybe you're imagining it. Maybe you're going insane. How would you know? This was life in the lower level of the Chateau d'If, and prisoners could spend decades here. One of the most famous prisoners was the Marquis de Sade. Yes, the same one who was in the Bastille. He seemed to collect prison experiences. He spent time in the Chateau d'If before being transferred to other prisons. His time here deepened his already dark worldview. But most prisoners weren't famous. They were Huguenots, French Protestants, imprisoned for their religion during Catholic persecution. They were political dissidents. They were people who'd offended someone powerful. Jean-Baptiste Chadaud was imprisoned in the Chateau d'If for 6 years for political reasons. When he was finally released, he'd lost his mind. He couldn't function in society. He died shortly after. Another prisoner, whose name was lost to history, carved a desperate message into his cell wall. God alone knows my innocence. The carving is still there today, a ghost's plea for justice that came too late. The psychological torture of the Chateau d'If wasn't just the isolation or the darkness. It was the knowledge that escape was impossible. You could see Marseille from the fortress, at least from the upper cells. You could see the city, the harbor, ships coming and going, normal life happening just a mile away. But you could never reach it. The water was too cold, the currents too strong, the distance too far. And even if you somehow made it to the water, the guards would shoot you before you got far. In the prison's entire history, no one successfully escaped the Chateau d'If. Not one person. In The Count of Monte Cristo, Dumas imagined an escape. He had to. It's fiction. The hero must escape to get his revenge. But reality was different. The men imprisoned in the real Chateau d'If didn't escape. They died there, or they were released years later, broken, insane, shadows of who they'd been. The fortress operated as a prison until 1914. Then it was decommissioned and eventually became a tourist attraction, made famous by Dumas's novel. Today, you can visit the Chateau d'If. You can take a boat from Marseille, a 20-minute ride. You can tour the cells. You can see the carvings prisoners left behind. You can stand in the dark lower-level cells and try to imagine years in that darkness. But you can't. Not really. Because you know you're leaving. You know the boat is waiting. You know that in an hour you'll be back in Marseille having lunch, enjoying the sunshine. The prisoners didn't have that knowledge. For them, the Chateau d'If was forever. One prisoner, before he died, carved a calendar into his cell wall. Days, months, years, hundreds of marks, thousands. He was counting, keeping track, refusing to let time become meaningless. The marks stop abruptly. He died before he could finish. The Chateau d'If, where prisoners were entombed in rock, where escape was impossible, where you could see freedom but never reach it, where men died in darkness, forgotten by the world. But at least the Chateau d'If was relatively small. It held dozens of prisoners, not hundreds. The scale of suffering, while intense, was limited. The final prison on our list was different. It operated for over 700 years. It held tens of thousands of prisoners. It killed more people than all the other prisons we've discussed combined. And it did so in the heart of London, in full view of the public. Welcome to Newgate Prison. Newgate Prison, London, December 18th, 1783. Morning. A crowd is gathering outside Newgate Prison. 10,000 people, 20,000, 50,000. By noon, the crowd will swell to over 100,000. They're not here to protest. They're here to watch people die. It's execution day at Newgate. And execution day is entertainment. Vendors sell food and drinks. Families bring children. People rent windows in nearby buildings for a better view. The wealthy pay premium prices for front-row standing spots. The atmosphere is festive, excited, bloodthirsty. At noon, the prison gates open. A cart emerges, carrying the condemned. Today, there are 10 of them, men and women, young and old. Some are murderers. Some are thieves. One is a 14-year-old boy who stole a handkerchief. They're all going to hang. This is Newgate Prison, and this is how London entertained itself for centuries. Newgate Prison operated from 1188 to 1904, over 700 years. It stood in the heart of London, near the Old Bailey Courthouse. It was rebuilt several times after fires and riots, but it always came back, always more forbidding, always more terrible. Newgate was many things over its long history. A debtor's prison, where people were imprisoned for owing money. A holding prison for those awaiting trial. And most famously, a prison for the condemned, those awaiting execution. But it was also something else, a death trap. Disease killed more prisoners at Newgate than execution ever did. The prison was chronically overcrowded. Hundreds of prisoners crammed into spaces meant for dozens. No sanitation, no ventilation, no clean water. The result was Newgate fever, typhus. It spread through the prison like wildfire, killing prisoners by the hundreds. But it didn't just kill prisoners. In 1577, An outbreak known as the Black Assizes killed the judge, jury, and numerous court officials who'd been exposed to prisoners brought from Newgate. Over 300 people died. The smell of Newgate was legendary. You could smell the prison from blocks away, the stench of human waste, decay, disease, and death. People held perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses when walking past. Inside was worse, much worse. Prisoners were packed into communal cells. Rich prisoners could pay for private cells, but most couldn't afford it. They slept on the floor, on top of each other, in their own filth. There was no separation by crime or age. Murderers mixed with petty thieves. Adults mixed with children. Yes, children. Newgate imprisoned children as young as 7, and sometimes executed them. In 1814, a 5-year-old boy was imprisoned in Newgate for stealing paint. He was eventually released, but the fact that a 5-year-old could be imprisoned at all shows how brutal the system was. Women were imprisoned in Newgate too, often in even worse conditions than men. They were assaulted by guards and other prisoners. Pregnant women gave birth in the cells with no medical care. Babies born in Newgate often died within days from disease or neglect. But the true horror of Newgate was the executions. For centuries, Newgate was the main execution site for London. Prisoners were hanged at Tyburn until 1783 or outside Newgate itself after 1783. Either way, Execution Day was a public spectacle. The condemned were paraded through the streets in carts. Crowds lined her out. Some threw things at the prisoners, rotten food, stones, insults. Others cheered them, treating them copy regenerate, like dislycanthropic, Claude 4.5 sonnet, continue like celebrities. Ballads were written about famous criminals. Their last words were recorded and sold as pamphlets. The gallows at Tyburn could hang 24 people at once. 24 nooses. 24 people standing on a cart. When the cart pulled away, they dropped. But hanging wasn't quick or clean. This wasn't the modern drop method that breaks the neck instantly. This was slow strangulation. Prisoners kicked and struggled. They turned purple. They took minutes to die. Sometimes family members would grab the legs and pull, trying to end the suffering faster. Sometimes the crowd would surge forward, touching the bodies, believing that a hanged man's hand could cure diseases. And sometimes the prisoner wasn't dead when they cut them down. There are documented cases of people hanged at Tyburn who revived afterward. They were usually pardoned. Surviving hanging was considered divine intervention. But most didn't survive. Most died slowly, painfully, while 100,000 people watched and cheered. The last public execution at Newgate happened in 1868. A man named Michael Barrett was hanged for his role in a bombing. 50,000 people watched him die. The crowd was so unruly, so violent, that the government finally decided public executions were too dangerous to continue. After that, executions moved inside Newgate's walls. But they continued. The last execution at Newgate was in 1902, a man named George Wolfe, hanged for murder. But execution wasn't the worst thing that happened at Newgate. For many prisoners, what came after death was worse. Bodies of executed prisoners weren't given to families. They were sold to medical schools for dissection. This was legal under the Murder Act of 1752. Part of your punishment was having your body cut apart by medical students after death. Imagine being a prisoner at Newgate. You're going to hang. You know this. You've accepted it. But you also know that after you die, your body will be taken to a medical theater. It will be stripped naked. It will be cut open. Students will remove your organs. They'll examine your brain. They'll take you apart piece by piece while spectators watch. And then, when they're done, what's left of you will be thrown away. No burial. No funeral, no peace. This was the final indignity, the final horror of Newgate. The prison was finally demolished in 1904. The Old Bailey Courthouse was expanded onto the site. Today, if you visit the Old Bailey, you're standing where Newgate Prison once stood, where thousands suffered, where thousands died. There's a plaque. That's all. A small plaque marking where the execution site was. Most people walk past without noticing. But the suffering that happened there, over 700 years of suffering, doesn't just disappear. The screams don't just fade. The deaths don't become less real because time has passed. Newgate Prison, where disease killed thousands, where children were imprisoned and executed, where public hangings drew crowds of 100,000, where bodies were sold for dissection, where suffering was entertainment. For over 700 years, Newgate stood as a monument to human cruelty. And when it finally fell, London celebrated. But we should remember, we must remember, 5 prisons, centuries of suffering, thousands of lives destroyed. The Tower of London, where queens were beheaded and prisoners carved their final messages into stone walls. The Bastille, where you could vanish with a stroke of the king's pen and die forgotten in darkness. Alcatraz, where isolation and silence drove America's toughest criminals insane. The Chateau d'If, where prisoners were entombed in rock and escape was impossible. And Newgate, where for 700 years, suffering and death were public entertainment. What do these prisons reveal about us? About humanity? They reveal our capacity for cruelty, our ability to dehumanize, our willingness to inflict suffering on those we deem unworthy of compassion. They reveal how easily justice becomes revenge, how quickly punishment becomes torture, how systems designed to maintain order become instruments of oppression. But they also reveal something else, our capacity to change. These prisons don't exist anymore, not as they were. We shut them down. We recognize that even criminals, even the worst criminals, deserve basic human dignity, that torture and cruelty don't serve justice, that isolation and darkness break the human spirit beyond repair. Prison reform happened because people saw the horror and said, enough. The Bastille was destroyed because it represented tyranny. Alcatraz was closed because it was too inhumane. Newgate was demolished because public executions had become barbaric. The Chateau d'If became a museum, a reminder of what we should never do again. We learned, slowly, painfully, but we learned. Yet we must never forget what happened in these places. The thousands who suffered, the innocent who were imprisoned, the guilty who were tortured beyond what any crime justified, the children who died, the minds that broke, the bodies that were destroyed. We must remember Anne Boleyn, walking to her execution with dignity despite her terror. The man in the iron mask, whose identity was so dangerous he wore a mask for 34 years. The prisoners in Alcatraz's hole, driven insane by darkness. The men entombed in the Chateau d'If's rock cells. The crowds at Newgate, treating death as entertainment. These weren't stories. These were real people, real suffering, real death. And the question we must ask ourselves is, have we truly learned? Are modern prisons humane? Do we still dehumanize prisoners? Do we still use isolation and darkness as punishment? Do we still forget that prisoners are human beings? The answer is complicated. We've come far, but we have farther to go. These historical prisons were living nightmares. May they remain in history. May we never return to such darkness. If this video made you think, made you feel, made you remember, please like and subscribe. Share it with others. These stories need to be told. These lessons need to be remembered. Leave a comment. Which of these prisons terrified you most? What other dark historical places should we explore? Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for believing that we can be better than our darkest history.